Hello everyone and welcome back to the Instant Insights podcast, a global data strategic intelligence. We track over 100 tech, industry, ESG and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm your host today, Martina Raveni, and I'm joined by Fox Walker, a senior analyst in our Aerospace Defense and Security team here at GlobalData, and our resident NATO expert. In this episode, we'll be discussing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For some context, NATO is an intergovernmental military alliance of 32 members established in the aftermath of World War II. A year ago, NATO members, except Spain, agreed to commit 5% of their annual GDP towards defense spending. 3.5% of this spending will be committed to core military requirements, and the remaining 1.5% will be committed to wider national security and resilience. This pledge came amidst the months of pressure from the Trump administration over perceived freeloading, a major point of contention with the Trump 1.0, let's say. So 1 year into the commitment, US sentiment over European security and defense remains unchanged, and we will discuss a bit on this, with the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth promising to review European defense spending in a conference last week. So this is more or less exactly what we were going to talk today with Fox. So welcome to Instant Insight. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I've just given a small bit of context about NATO in the last year or so spending agreements, but can you give our listeners a bit more in-depth background of the treaty before 2025?
Definitely. So I think it goes back to 2014 as one of the key dates. That was when the NATO summit in Wales happened, and that's where the 32 allies agreed to spend 2% of defense of their GDP as quickly as possible. And it took 10 years to reach that, and it took a number of factors to reach that. And there's a lot of debate in the United States about who made that happen, who is responsible for getting Europe to spend more on defense. But I would say, rather than picking any one in the United States, that it's actually Vladimir Putin who made that change, because when Russia launched its unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine, that's really when you begin to see the big shift in European defense spending and the big increase that has happened. And so last year we had that agreement for 5%, I definitely it's correct to say that the Trump administration was leading the charge on that. But I would say that there were some members of NATO, some allies in NATO, who were just as ready, and actually perhaps maybe a little bit more ready for Europe to start spending more on defense, especially if you start looking at places like Poland and the Baltic states, which already spend more of a percent of GDP than the United States or most other allies on defense. These were places that really wanted to see Europe start spending more, because these places are right next to Russia and really fear for Europe's security. So that's kind of been the change in the last year.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for the overview. Yeah, you mentioned that last year we saw like the beginning of Trump's reelection, and NATO held its 2025 summit at Hague, where the 5% of GDP commitment you mentioned on defense spending was agreed. But I wanted to ask you, according to what do you think, what were the key drivers behind this new commitment, and how has Trump's reelection shifted in a way NATO last year?
Okay, so I think that there were two major factors that have led Europe to start spending more, and for the Trump administration to push so far, and that actually Europe's spending is because of the way that Trump has talked about the world since his inauguration. And so there are two key moments. I think the first is the Trump re-election in November of 2024. And I think a lot of Europeans were like, oh, wow, this Trump is not going away, and that America is going to be an unreliable ally when it comes to European affairs. However, I think the second key moment is Trump's inauguration a couple months later. Because at his inauguration, that's when he starts talking about Canada. That's when he starts talking about Greenland, and it starts talking about expanding American territory, which really reasonably so scares a lot of allies within NATO, because as NATO observers will know, the principle of non-aggression, which appears after the Second World War, is a founding principle of NATO. And so with that being questioned by President Trump's territorial ambitions, that encourages places like Denmark and really just the entire continent to really spike defense spending, because they're afraid of the Trump administration's actions against NATO, but also on the other edge of the continent with Ukraine and wanting to continue to support Ukraine and just to prevent Russia from taking any territory of NATO.
That's a chain of events that unfolded really, really quickly compared to the usual. In terms of the amount of spending, are there any other nation actually spending 5% of their GDP? Or in general, my question is, who are the biggest leaders so far in spending? Are any countries struggling to meet these targets or pushing a little back?
Okay, so we'll break this down in a few ways. We'll first look at who the biggest spenders are within NATO, and we'll look at that in two different ways. And this is really important for listeners to understand that a country is NATO is looking at spending about what share of your GDP are you spending on defense, but also what does that mean in dollar value, right? Because a small country, like a country in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they're spending about 5% or more of their GDP on defense. However, they're relatively small economies, and put together, the Baltic states only are 6 million people, and an alliance of 1 billion, that's less than 1%, right?
Makes sense.
You can look then at middle-sized economies within Europe, like Poland, that are also spending. I think GlobalData has said that in 2026 we're expecting about 4.9% of GDP. But again, they're a middle-sized economy. So even with that, the total value of the spending of Poland and the United Kingdom, which has about a very large a much larger economy and a lot higher population, are relatively similar, and that's because the United Kingdom doesn't spend as much as a share of its GDP. So the big players as far as spending goes right now are the Baltic states and Poland. The places to watch for spending leaders soon are going to be the Nordic states, so especially Norway and Denmark. Denmark in particular really being frustrated with the Trump administration. They've increased rapidly even before the Trump administration, though, so it's not just a Greenland thing. Norway, again, is going to be, I think, maybe the 5th highest spender by value. Sweden, the newest ally, is also really taking up the charge. When it comes, so that's as a share of GDP. If you're looking at a by value picture, that's where things get to change, because that's actually where Germany, the country that people really love to complain about when it comes to European defense spending, is really stepping up. So we think by the end of I think next year we're saying about 2.8% of GDP, and by the end of by 2029 or so, hitting 3% or more. The government. I apologize. The government itself of Germany has said 3.5% by 2030, which is a really big deal. As Europe's largest economy, that'll look something like $200 billion per year, which again, that's only about a fifth of what the United States spends. However, it's 80 million people versus 350 million people, and the U.S. is a really large economy. The U.S. I think we'll save for a little bit later in this episode. Needless to say, it's the largest spender by pure volume alone, and then that it spends. Last year it spent more than $1 trillion on its defense, and it's going to spend a lot more than that in the future. We'll get to, but it's not the highest spender as a share of GDP. That's Poland and the other states, the Baltic states that we talked about. That is rapidly changing with this year's budget, but we're not. The United States isn't there yet. If you're looking for people to complain about, there's no shortage. I'll tell you. I mean, actually, maybe that's being a bit too harsh. I would say there are a few outliers. Everyone is spending 2%, or at least they have on paper that they're spending 2%.
On paper?
Yes.
Okay.
Some countries do a little bit of accounting wizardry, as we call it. So if you look in particular at Italy, they say that they're spending 2%, and NATO agrees that they're spending 2%, but they include police forces, which typically don't count as defense expenditure. Usually we're looking for things like tanks and for trained servicemen and things like that. They're also trying to claim that a highway between the island of Sicily and the rest of Italy should count as defense expenditure. So there are a few laggards. Italy, hopefully they've got a plan. They've been working with NATO to get things together. A lot of this, I will say, frankly, was optics to get every country to 32. There was a little bit of leeway in how we got to that number, but we are every militarized country in NATO, all 31 except for Iceland, who doesn't have a military, are spending 2%. The other places that are kind of behind, we mentioned Spain. As they have not agreed to spend 5% of their GDP by 2035. They're the only country to have done that. The rest of NATO said that is going to be feasible. And I would say, kind of as the trend, and it's not entirely true, but the trend is that the further you get away from Russia and Ukraine, the lower percentage of GDP you spend on defense. So places like Poland that are on the border spend a lot, while places like Spain, which are relatively far from Russia and Ukraine, spend less. There are outliers to that. The United Kingdom, working at GlobalData, a British company, that's an interesting case. This week they just put out their defense investment plan, which set out their plan by 2029 to spend more on GDP. Most people who watch NATO say, and watch the United Kingdom, say that that's probably not enough to keep them on track to hitting that 3.5% by 2035. There's still time, but it's just going to put a little bit of a crunch for the next parliament in that case. The UK has said they're going to spend about 2.7% starting, I think, next year, and then going through, that'll stay the same till 2029. Most onlookers would say that they can do a little bit more than that. They have political constraints with pensioner expectations and the fact that, again, you are quite far from Ukraine here, and people feel relatively safe and don't really feel the threat that is kind of holding them back from spending a bit more, perhaps.
And just leaving a bit Ukraine-Russia conflict, but talking about other conflict in the world. So the last year has seen a lot of continued and renewed conflict across the world. Where has NATO stood during the recent US, Israel, Iran conflict?
Yeah, so this is really important for people to understand when you're looking at NATO, that it is a defensive alliance, right? So that means that they're not going to go get involved in wars that don't pose a direct threat to a member state of NATO, an ally of NATO. And in this case, talking about the Iran war, this is a war of choice for America, and that the United States can make arguments and say that there was a direct threat to the United States national security, but they didn't actually trigger Article 5, which is when they have been attacked, and the rest of Europe does not see this as a threat to America's sovereignty. And so, unlike the only time in NATO history when a country has triggered Article 5 is after 9/11, when America was attacked. That's when European allies did stand side by side with the United States and lost thousands of servicemen and women in combat. So they do not see that as the same. They do not see this war as the same type of threat that they saw in Iraq. And given the result of the Iraq war, probably were not too eager to help out this time.
Going back to Europe, what is the U.S. sentiment on European security?
Yes. So I think to understand the United States right now, you need to look at three foundational principles, or at least three post-war principles of American leadership. And for me, those commitments that America made after the Second World War are to the principle of non-aggression, which says that a state won't invade another sovereign state, the commitment to free trade, and then finally the commitment to the peaceful transfer of power. And my view toward this, and why I think the United States is so frustrated with Europe, is that Europe has not made the same political decisions as a whole that the United States have. And I think if you look at those three principles that I just laid out, that the United States has broken each one of those in the Trump administrations that Europe has not. So if we take that in a case-by-case basis, you have President Trump talking about invading Greenland, about incorporating Canada. That is that would be a clear violation of the principle of non-aggression. If you look at free trade, look at President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. That really upset Europe and really upset the global economy. And then finally, if you look at the peaceful transfer of power and President Trump's role in the January 6th insurrection, I think there are real concerns from Europeans about what's going to happen if Democrats do win the Electoral College in 2028, and will the peaceful transfer of power continue in the United States. So there are real concerns there that I think the United States, the current administration, does not understand why Europe is not on board with these things. However, it's actually the United States who has changed its direction, and Europe has been consistent relatively with those three principles as compared to the United States. So the changes come from the United States, and America doesn't understand why it's isolated, but it's because of its changes to those three principles.
Makes sense. My next question, tell me if I'm wrong, but in the last week or so, there has been renewed interest in a NATO Plan B, sort of, across Europe. Can you tell us a bit more about these plans, or with more specificity than me, and what it means for the future of NATO?
I would say that NATO is not NATO without the United States. And so what I mean by that is that currently a majority of defense spending in 2026, it'll be 60% of all defense spending amongst the 32 allies comes from the United States, and 40% of it will come from Europe and Canada. So it's really difficult to imagine an alliance in which 60% of its capabilities have been ripped away. And what I'll tell you is that it's not just about the defense spending. That if you go to NATO headquarters in Brussels, that you will see that half of the offices are taken up by Americans. You will learn if you talk to people who work at NATO that Europe has a lot of military capabilities and a lot of great things that it's good at when it comes to military capabilities. However, it does not necessarily have the same intelligence capabilities and the same command and control capabilities as the United States has, which the United States contributes to NATO. And so, if the United States, if there's going to be some sort of NATO Plan B, if you will, which I think would look at an alliance without the United States. That's quite a disturbing picture, if you ask me, because that will just give Europe a weaker view of what's happening within Ukraine, and it will it'll leave the alliance with fewer capabilities.
That's so good that you mentioned not just a matter of amount of investment, but also about technological capabilities and advances. So I think we're ready for my final question.
Okay.
Talking about the future, do you have any final thoughts on what the rest of this year will bring for NATO? Yeah,
I'm going to try to end us on a positive note, because I think that onlookers are going to be really surprised when they see this year's statistics for what NATO will be spending. At GlobalData, if you read our 2026 NATO Strategic Intelligence Report, I've already gone through and seen what each country has said that they're going to tell NATO that they've spent this year. And I was shocked at just how much that number has changed within a year or two. And so if you're looking at places like Germany, if you're looking at places like the Nordic states, a change is coming to NATO is what I would say. I would say that Europeans are really taking defense seriously. By the end of this decade, Europe will be a very different continent, and the U.S. will have less influence over NATO. That's one thing that we didn't say, is that as Europe rearms. The United States has played a big role in NATO leadership. It's played a big role in European affairs, whether that be economic or military or social affairs. It will have less influence because of the decisions that this administration has made, and Europe will be stronger, not just economically, not just militarily, but it'll be more independent and hopefully more able to make its own decisions.
Thank you so much, Fox, for those instant insights. I learned so much in 20 minutes and very clear delivered, so thanks a lot. To find more about our GlobalData reports and the reports that Fox just mentioned, check the episode description. And from all of us in Strategic Intelligence, see you next time.